In this chapter in your textbook, we'll be using Python to work with SQLite databases. Now, the SQLite database engine comes with Python. When you install Python on your computer, you get this SQLite database engine. And to use it, there is a module named SQLite 3. You'll notice that as we work through the chapter, all of the programs that we're going to write have this statement, import SQLite 3. And if you want to work with SQLite at the Python shell, you can simply type the import statement like I've done here. Now, to work with a database in SQLite, you have to create a connection. You have to get a connection to that database. And the statement that we're going to execute looks like this. And let's say that in this example, I'm going to connect to a database called test.db. This is my test database. So at this point, I now have a connection to a database called test.db. You'll see here that I executed a function called connect, which is in the SQLite 3 module, and that creates a connection to this database, and it returns an object that is known as a connection object. Now you can see here in this statement, I've assigned the connection object to a variable named con. Now, if the database does not exist, if that test.db database isn't there in my default directory, then this statement is going to create the database. If the database already exists, then it simply connects us to that existing database. So at this point, we have our connection object, and in a typical Python program, we're going to perform lots of operations with the database. And in order to do that, we have to get another type of an object known as a cursor object. A cursor object is simply an object that points to a position within a database, and it allows us to add information to the database or delete information from the database or whatever. And now in order to get that cursor object, we're going to execute a statement that looks like this. So here you can see in this statement, I've called a method that is part of our connection object called cursor. Now this method, the cursor method, returns a cursor object, and you can see that we have assigned it to a variable named cur. Now, if we were actually performing operations with the database, at this point we would use this cursor object to do whatever it is that we want to do with the database. Now, when you're finished performing your operations on the database, you should commit any changes that have been made. What this means is that if we've changed the database, if we've added data to it, or if we have deleted data, or perhaps we've updated some existing data in the database, if we've made any changes, we want to save those changes to the database. And to do that, we call a method that's part of our connection object called commit, and that saves whatever changes that we've made to the database. And then when we're finished, we can simply close the connection to the database. And we do that with another method in our connection object called close, and that closes the connection. So at this point, we are no longer connected to the test.db database. Well, now let's look at a Python program that performs these steps. This is my SQLite skeleton program. I call it a skeleton program because it doesn't really do anything to the database. It just connects to the database, and it demonstrates how to get a cursor object and how to commit our changes and then close the database. So at the top of the program, we have our import statement, which imports the SQLite 3 module. Then we have the definition of our main function, and then here we have the code that calls the main function. Now, inside the main function, the first thing that happens is that we connect to a database named contacts.db, and then here in this statement, we get a cursor object on that database. And then here in this section, any statements that we would write to perform operations on the database, we would write those statements here. And then once we're finished, this statement calls the connection object's commit method, which saves any changes that we made to the database. And then this statement calls the connection object's close method, which closes the connection to the database. So this is sort of a template, if you will, of how you will write your code to connect to an SQLite database. Now, I'll mention that here in this example, we're connecting to a database named contacts.db. And when it's written this way, we're assuming that the contacts.db file is located in the current directory, the default directory. This is the directory where our program is operating. It might be the directory where the program is located, but really it's the default directory. It's the directory that we are currently working with. Now, this may or may not be the location where your database is actually stored, or it may not be the location where you want to create the database. Quite often, you'll want to write an absolute path here when you specify the name of the database. For example, suppose we are using a Windows machine, and suppose that the database, the contacts.db database, is in a folder on our C drive called databases. So we could write an absolute path that specifies the exact location of the contacts.db database. This is an example of what it would look like on Windows. Now, let's suppose that you're using Mac OS or perhaps you're using Linux. Then the path is going to look different. It may look something like this. But the point is that regardless of your operating system, you can specify the exact location on your system where the database is located. So in summary, these are the steps that you'll take in your Python programs to connect to an SQLite database and perform operations with that database. First, you're going to connect to the database. This gives you a connection object. Then you'll get a cursor object for that database. The cursor object will allow you to perform operations. Then you'll perform any operations that you want on the database, and when you're finished, you'll commit any changes that you've made to the database. This saves the changes. And last, you'll close the database connection.